Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Race, Crime, and Justice. This is week 4. This is our 4th video lecture. And today we're going to talk about race and criminal victimization. And if you've read through the chapter already before watching this lecture video, good on you. You know we're going to be talking about a lot of different things. Um, I do want to point out and mention that much like all good education does, each week builds on the next. So we're going to talk about things from the previous chapters. So please make sure that you're keeping up with the work because it does matter. So, as I said, we're going to be talking about race and criminal victimization today. And without further ado, we're just going to get right into it. And so, first, we need to define what is criminal victimization. And criminal victimization in our text, it even has a definition at the end of the chapter: the harming of people by conventional crime. In other words, in the most basic words I can use in terms, being the victim of a crime. Period. Criminal victimization is being the victim of a crime. And if you're like, okay, that really simple, why are we talking about it? Well, because there is deeper issues that we've already talked about in previous chapters, that we see that the data shows that there is an increased percentage of individuals who commit crime. And in particular, we saw in last chapter that, there is less than really a percentage of African Americans who are committing crime, but that less than 1% is committing nearly 50% of the crime, and that's a big issue. That's a lot of crime, and it's being disproportionate. So we see that, yeah, they're committing more crime. But now we need to look at the victimization, because that too plays a part in this. And it's gonna get dark and heavy. I'm gonna be completely honest. This week's class, the lecture, the reading, the outside readings I'm having you do, this is not a happy week. This is not a super positive week of, well, there's easy changes we can make. This is going to be a heavy subject. So I'm letting you know now, if you haven't read through and you're listening to the lecture first, please know that this is not going to be an easy week as far as like content. It's not hard. It's emotionally difficult. So please bear that in mind, because we're going to be talking about victims of crimes, and in particular, we're going to be talking about some crimes that are difficult for people to listen about, talk about, things like that. So, what we see from the data for criminal victimization is that there is a disparity based on race. As of 2016, 2017, the data that this book primarily pulls from, because that was very fleshed out, full data. Obviously, we've had a couple more since then, but this is a really good example to use. As of 2016, 2017, African Americans made up 13 total percent of the national population, but they accounted for, so they were represented. 52% of all homicide victims were African American. So that means 52% of all homicides between in the years of 2016, 2017 were directed at 13% of the total population. Over half of all homicides were on a 13% of the population. Even if you don't know statistics that well, that alone should make you go, that doesn't seem right. More than half of all these reported crimes of homicide were targeted towards a 13% of a population. That's less than a quarter. That's not a lot. That that shows that there is a big disparity in how victims are being depicted within these crime rates. And then when we look at the NCVS, if you remember the National Crime Victims Survey data, um, what we find is that African Americans were 23% more likely to be victims of all violent crimes than white Americans. So they were 52% of all homicide victims, but they were 23% more likely to be a victim of all violent crime compared to a white American percentage, as well as 46% for serious violent crimes more likely than white Americans. And because we've talked about it before, the Latinx data shows that they were 21% more likely to be victims of serious violent crimes than white Americans. What this tells us is that it's not that white Americans are not the victims of crime, but what we see is that the percentage of white victims is lower than those than people of color. So again, we're not saying that there are no white victims and there are only these. No, there are victims that are white, there are victims of color, but what we see is that when we break it down to what percentage of the crime is being committed, we see it more common against people of color than we see against white Americans. And so what I really want to talk about in particular with this week, not that any one race is important or rather more important than another, but we haven't really. This is a particular population that's not talked about appropriately and sufficiently in a lot of school work from high school down. And this is one of those rare opportunities where we can talk about this. And so we are going to talk about Native Americans in particular a little bit today. But if you've also looked at the additional readings for this week, they are about Native American crime rates. Simply because if you came into Race, Crime, and Justice thinking, we're only going to talk about African Americans, no, we're talking about every race and how race, crime, and justice plays in together. So this week, we're just talking about Native Americans. But in general, overall, Native American victimization data is sparse. We have more data on Native Americans who are incarcerated. We don't have a whole lot of the victimization data. Part of that is that the NCVS is a federal American government, and there is a lot of distrust of the American government by a lot of the local Native American tribes, and that's fair. Historically speaking, the Native Americans have been a particular target for a lot of different groups, including the federal government. Even not just talking American, but just all of North America in general. Canadian and Native Canadians, in Native Canadian or North American Indians, wrong word, sorry. The Native Americans of the Canada area and some Inuit people from the upper Alaska Arctic Circle. These individuals have faced similar negative responses from Canadians as well as from United States citizens. Like, this is a group that is not exclusive to the United States, but we're talking about the United States data here. So, despite the fact that we don't have a lot of the victimization rate data, there is a longitudinal study from 1992 to 2002, and I found the Department of Justice's 58, I think, page report on this data. I included it in the weeks folder. It's not required reading, but if you're interested in this, I tried to find it and provide it to you. So this data about Native American victimization rates, that is a large document that is on Blackboard. But this longitudinal study and the data that they found, what they found was that 101 per 1,000 people ages 12 and older that are Native American were victims of violent crimes. And we'll get into it in a little bit, but particularly sexually assault and battery, those kinds of violent crimes, including homicide. Please note, Native American. 101 people per 1,000 people. That is just over 10% of victims who are aged 12 and older of violent crimes in this data were Native Americans, compared to, in the same time span, 50 per 1,000 for African Americans, that's about 5%, 41 per 1,000 for white Americans, which is about 4%, and 22 per 1,000 for Asian Americans, which is about 2%. Native Americans were twice as likely as African Americans to be victims of violent crimes in that time span when looking at the longitudinal data between 92 and 2002. They were more likely to be victims of violent crimes than any other group. And in exploring this, an important piece of information came out that we are going to talk about. And one of the major findings in this data is that overall, Native Americans suffer more interracial crimes than any other group. And if you're going, what the heck does that mean? We need to talk about the difference between interracial and intraracial. So interracial means between races, more than one. So interracial crime, when we're talking about this means that white on black crime, Asian on black, Asian on white, Asian Native American, Pacific Islander, Asian, it doesn't matter. The distinction is that there's more than one race that is committing crime onto a different group. That's interracial crime. Intraracial crime means among one's own race, the same group. So intraracial is black on black crime, Latinx on Latinx, white on white. Doesn't matter, there's not other groups. And so that is an important distinction for the rest of the data and for the rest of the chapter that we need to understand, is the difference between interracial and intraracial crime. And so for those of you who are interested as we talk about this to see the actual charts and the data, I have provided the pages for you. So we're going to be talking about Table 4.2 and Table 4.3, which are on page 77 and 78, respectively. And what they are is, Table 4.2 is race and ethnicity of homicide victims and offenders. And this data comes from 2016. And in particular, what it is looking at, it's looking at the percentages of crimes, the homicide crime rates. So as I go through this data, hopefully you understand it. I don't have the charts here. You can follow along on the charts in the book, but I put the data here so that you can see, hopefully clearly put forward. So what we have on the left side here, where we have African American, Latinx, and white, these are the race or ethnicity of the offender. And our percentage is when the offender was African American, the percentage of homicide victims who were African American was 90% of homicide victims from African American homicide were African American victims. There was no data available for the Latinx, but 8% for white. So that means that African Americans who committed homicide, for this data from 2016, 8% of their victims were white, while 90% were African Americans. And so when we look at it, looking at the Latinx data, Latinx homicide offenders, in general, the data is not relevant there, but 67% were Latinx individuals. And then for white crime, we saw that white homicide offenders, their primary victim was 82% white victims and 15% African American victims. So what we're seeing here is exactly what I was getting at when we talked about Native Americans. Native Americans, their victimization tends to be interracial, where the percentage is higher of another group committing crime on them versus intraracial, which is what most criminal victimization is intraracial. And part of that is a social issue in general, and that is who are the people you interact with? And if you're confused by this, I'm just going to say it now. Think about your social group. Think about the people you see every day, the people you talk to, the people you interact with, the people you keep as part of your inner circle. Are they people of the same color, the same background, the same religion, the same ethics, the same fan base? What is the group of people that you tend to spend most time with? They often tend to be people that you have similar belief structures or interests with. When we talk about criminality, part of the reason that we see a lot of intraracial crime victimization. Sorry about that, folks. My microphone died, so I had to swap out. Anyway, um, where was I? Oh, I'm just going to start again. Hopefully, editing Mr. Wheaton will fix it. So, what we see from this data, or rather, what we understand if you think about the people you interact with, the reason interracial crime happens and victimization happens so often is because these are the people that you're surrounding yourself with. These are the people that are near you. And so, of course, your victims are going to be people of a similar race or of a similar economic background, where you're located. It's This is a really weird example to give. It's something I do talk about in the initial Blackboard post for this week. I do mention a little bit about my own personal history. Um, I was raised on the Lower East Side of town. I went to a decent school on scholarship and with a lot of help. But a lot of my friends grew up on the west side of town. And they were told, and their parents believed that I lived in the bad part of town. I lived in the ghetto. They could not come to my house. If they did, it had to be during the day, and they had to leave before the sun went down. Obviously, that was a little extreme. I lived there, and really, that wasn't a common issue. And even as I got into an adulthood, people I knew always felt uncomfortable in areas like where I grew up. And my conversation was always, if you live here, you are part of this community. They recognize you. You don't stick out like a sore thumb. When you're panicking, you are obviously not from this area. And so it's one of those things that outsiders tend to believe that they're going to be the target for more crime when they go to these areas. It's typically not it. Nobody wants to deal with an outsider because that usually means more trouble. You deal with the people within because they're not going to complain. It's a bad way of looking at it, but it's important to note that this is what it comes down to. The reason we see there's still crime against other races. It's just the majority is committed by the same group, and that's because it's convenient. The particular crime is available. We'll talk a little bit about this more in a bit. But it's just important to note that there is a distinction here. And so we look at another piece of data, table 4.3, which again is on page 78 instead. This time it looks at violent crimes, or rather non-fatal violent crimes. And it looks at data not just from 1 year, but it is a compilation of data from 2012 to 2015. And so in particular, same breakdown, same groups, but what we see is that the Offender, again, are on the left side here on the slide, and the percentage of the race, quote unquote, of the victims is on the right. And so we see African Americans, 78% African American are their victims, 25% Latinx, 18% white. For the Latinx community, it was 8% African Americans, 50% Latinx, and 13% white. And for the whites, it was 14% African American, 25% Latinx, and 69% white. You're going to note, but wait, Mr. Wheaton, why is the data not adding up to 100%? This does kind of come with a problem. Part of that is just the fact that it is an estimation, mathematical kind of range, so sometimes the numbers don't add up completely correctly. But the other thing with this is that non-fatal violence includes aggravated and simple assault, rape or sexual assault, and robbery. And the African American and white categories don't include Latinx, so there is some wiggle room with the data. Sometimes they cross over, so it's not a perfect system, but what we see is that that percentage gives us a rough idea of where they fall. And so what we see, even if we don't take the numbers as exact truth, so it might not be 78, 25, 18, we do know that majority is African American, next Latinx, and then white. That kind of thing. So that's important to note. What we know from this data, and there is a separate piece specifically on page 78, and why I say we'd be coming back to the Native American data. A notable exception to the intraracial nature of criminal victimization involves Native Americans. In the NCVS report on their victimization discussed earlier, that one that's this longitudinal 92 to 2002, 88% of the violence against Native Americans were committed by African Americans or whites. So that's important. 88% of the violence that they received was from African Americans or by whites. The same held true in a recent national survey evidence on the victimization of Native Americans by sexual violence and intimate partner physical violence. Thus, we come back down to this point that what we find is that typically Native Americans are more likely to be victims of interracial crime, being targeted by another race outside of their own, when compared to other races who tend to be intraracial or crimes committed by their own people. Hopefully that's straightforward enough, but here's where we get into this. There are two major sets of factors that help us understand this data and to understand why we see this huge percentage that doesn't seem to make sense. And those are structural factors and individual factors. And if you paid attention last week, you'll know we've talked about structural factors. A lot of this is really what we talked about last week. So things like economic disadvantage, social and physical characteristics of both the location and the people involved, high poverty rates, residential mobility, residential density, high crime rate areas like near bars and pubs and things like that that encourage or rather bring in people who commit crime. All of these structural factors play a part in understanding that data. Think about how we said that these kind of factors can lead individuals to be criminals, to commit crime. It also can lead individuals to be victims of crime. If you are in an economic disadvantage or in an area with high poverty, you are just as likely to be a criminal who commits crime as you are to be a victim of crime. If there is a lot of residents packed tightly in, but there's not a lot of people that are there for the long haul, they come in and they move out very quickly, this density and mobility issue, there's not really people that are there that are going to, stop a crime from being committed. They're going to keep to themselves because they're planning on just leaving. All of these factors play a role. And I said high crime areas. And if you notice, I have in parentheses hot spots. And so this is a colloquial term, but it's a term that we use to refer to particular areas within an area that crime seems to occur more often. And so, on average, according to the text and according to a lot of data that we have, about 5% of all of a city's locations of crime, they tend to 50% of all crimes and victimizations happen in only about 5% of a city's locations. So, if I was to challenge you, if you've lived in Erie for all of your life, can you think of any area of the city that you've always known or always been told is a high place for crime or things like that? It's important to think about. Hint, hint, maybe about discussion board. But hotspot areas, this is something that criminologists look at when they're trying to figure out policies for policing and how to affect positive change. Heck, Restore Erie and several other community groups that are trying to improve the quality of life in Erie look at this data. They look at hotspots and what are the hotspots in Erie. Some people may argue that Ash Street is a potential hotspot area, especially in certain number blocks. Some people might say it's East Avenue. Some people might say it's State Street. Some people might say it's Parade Street. Some people might say it's Front Street. What they do is they look at the data, they look at the crime rates and the victimization rates, and what we find when we look at these maps, and I didn't think to get one this week for this class, but I will try to find one and upload it. But you can actually see crime maps that show you where there are higher rates of crime in a city. This is something that is a fairly common thing in criminal justice. And I feel bad that I didn't think of this before this moment. But we see this. And we know that that means that there is more likely to be crime there. And then when we look at the population there, the type of people that live there, then we start to get an idea of who are the victims of these crimes. So, when we talk about victimization rates, we also talk about routine activities theory. And this is technically part of the structural factors, but I would argue it's also an individual factor. In general, criminal victimization is more likely to occur when the following are found to be true together. And this is where routine activities theory comes in. I'm going to explain in just a second. The idea is that number one, the presence of an attractive target for crime, that there is a presence of a motivated offender, and there is the absence of guardianship. Attractive target for crime means that this is an easy hit or something that's going to be worthwhile. Absence of guardianship means there's not really security. There's not really people that are there to stop the crime from being committed. And all you need is that motivated offender, someone who goes, yep, I need to do this. Routine activities theory is the idea that human beings, we have routine activities. We do the same thing over and over and over again, day in, day out. With that knowledge in place, that means that there are certain areas that are going to be more likely to be hit for crime than opposed to others, especially if they are areas where guardianship is low, active targets may be available, these kinds of things. The big takeaway, and I even emphasized it for you, a big takeaway from this particular piece, from understanding what we mean when we say, when we say victimization rates and routine activities theory, when we say that you need these three things to kind of work together, what we're saying is that the environment plays a role in the victimization rates of individuals. No better example, the text even brings it up, is Chicago. Chicago has historically been a disproportionate percentage of crime rates for the entire United States. Yeah, New York, Los Angeles also has an impact, but Chicago has always had a direct impact. And part of that is the way Chicago is laid out, the environment there, the social issues, the structural issues, the individuals, all of these things play together and create a disproportionate data that, while is not wholly wrong, it does skew that data to a certain point. Environment plays a role. If you are in an environment that has a very attractive target to be hit, and there is not really a whole lot of security or people that are caring and watching for this stuff, it's going to be a high location for target for being a crime, which means if you are in that area, you are at a higher likelihood of being a victim. And so the other side of this is individual factors. We talked about the social factors, the environmental factors, all these things that are outside of control. These are things that, while you can, quote, control them, you can't control them. Individual factors are things that come down to the individual and decisions that may or may not make you more likely to be a victim or a criminal. Again, going back to what we talked about last week, just because you're at a higher rate doesn't mean you are or were going to be a criminal. It just means you were more likely to be. Anyway, so individual factors look primarily at the regular behaviors of individuals that lead to criminal victimization. And that really is lifestyle theory in a nutshell. And if you really wanted to know a very simple way of explaining it, the riskier the lifestyle, the more likely an individual will be victimized. Plain and simple. Lifestyle theory puts forward the idea that the way you behave, interact, live, do things, if you are more risky in your behaviors, you are more likely to be targeted and be a victim than if you are more conservative and more reserved and private, that kind of thing. Obviously, it's more complicated than that, but that is a big component of individual factors. How you live your life plays a part. A big part of this lifestyle theory issue with individual factors is self-control. People who lack good self-control tend to be more impulsive. They act without thinking of the consequences of their actions. When you act without thinking about the potential consequences, you don't really have good self-control, you are more likely to cause a situation where you may be target. You may be a target, or you may unwittingly commit a crime. Self-control is a big thing. Unfortunately, after we talk about this in the next one, there's going to be something that we need to talk about a little bit. Another component of this is the role of social relationships. So I know my mother used to say, if you sleep with the pigs, you're going to smell like a pig. That's what the role of social relationships really comes down to when we talk about individual factors that lead to victimization. It's the individuals you associate with can put you in contact with potential offenders. If you hang out with drug dealers, the likelihood that you are going to be connected to a drug dealer and maybe the target by a rival drug dealer increases. The more social relationships you have with gang members or a motorcycle gang, the more likely you will be a target of crime and retaliation for that group. The more you associate with the plain as day milk toast, I drink milk and go to bed by 8 p.m. people, the less likely you are to be in contact with someone who's going to commit a crime against you. It's those kinds of the people you interact with, the way you live your life will play a role and impact who you come in contact with. And unfortunately, and this is where I said we have to have a kind of awkward conversation. Another big factor in all this is history of childhood problems. So typically, this also includes issues where child abuse and child neglect. Not saying that history of childhood problems means you were committing child abuse or child neglect. No, it means that you were abused or neglected as a child. Those factors tend to play a role in that, and partly because this includes childhood interactions with criminal justice system, criminal behavior, deviance, other problematic behaviors or situations, the to note is this weird takeaway and why we have to have this conversation. Individuals with a history of childhood problems are also more apt to have low self-control, alcohol or drug dependency problems. They tend to break the law, and they also usually have low quality social relationships. What this means is that individuals who have a history of childhood problems tend to be more likely to have more than that as a factor. They might also have low self control. They might have low quality social relationships that put them in contact with a potential offender. They might have some kind of dependency problem that puts them again in contact with more people that could be offenders. They might have broken the law, or they're at a higher rate to break the law. They're going to be in situations that put them closer in contact with individuals who could victimize them. The issue is that, again, just because one or multiple of these is true does not mean that you are going to be a criminal or you are going to be a victim. All it means is that with this data, what we see is that individuals who have multiple of these things tend to be at a higher rate of victimization. So, with that in mind, the other things that socioeconomic factors may also play a part in the individual factors and that an individual may face that leads to higher victimization rates. If you consider history of childhood problems, low self-control, and low quality social relationships, those three alone, there's a connection to socioeconomic factors like how much money, the location that you live in, geographic locations, the type of people that you live near, the type of housing. All these things are compounding issues. And what that means is that it's not just one, it's one builds on top of the other, on top of the other. And all of a sudden, it's not just one issue or two issues, it's a million issues. What we need to understand if we're trying to figure out why the data shows that African Americans commit more violent crimes towards other African Americans. Why do we see that percentage? Well, because the socioeconomic factors of these groups tend to mean that they live in low value neighborhoods where there's not a lot of actual community, and all of a sudden there's higher rates of crime in that area, and because there's higher rates of crime, the children that grow up there are more likely to either get involved with crime or they know of the crime. And because they live in that area and they know of it, they could be victimized, whether for theft or assault or anything of that nature. And because that they're being targeted and victimized, that leads to this increase in the rate of intraracial crime. And what we also see, an additional piece that I didn't write here but is important to note, is that individuals who were victimized as children, well, we'll see that in a little bit, but people who were victimized as children sometimes become adults that commit crime because it's what they know, it's how they cope with it, that's what makes you work, so I'm going to do it. You create an endless vicious cycle. And so what we see is, unfortunately, the data is accurate because the social and economic and individual factors of these people and how they live and how they interact leads to further victimization, further crime. So I'm sure some of you are saying, well, then what's the answer? How do we solve it? And if you remember, I said a while back, criminal justice likes to be black and white, but it's a lot of gray. There's not a simple answer here. And I wish I could be positive and say there is a simple answer here. The simple answer is let's just end racism and make everything equal, but even that's not an easy answer. So take that as you will. Last thing I have on this slide before we move on, there is more to this, but I want to talk about immigration victimization. In particular, they are a kind of significant sub point. I'm trying to think of how to say this without being offensive because it's not what I'm trying to say. Um, what we see when we consider all of these factors, there is something that needs to be mentioned that's not part of this. It's we find at the bottom of page 83. It's its own little subsection. It's got an italicized little heading that says immigration, and the data that they discuss throughout this whole last part talks about Latinx youth higher victimization rates, and part of that comes down to the way their immigration status is viewed. Um, Specifically, Latinx and Asian Americans. Um, Typically, the immigration status is a big thing that's thrown in their face and used as kind of a racist flag to rally behind fighting for, especially as we continue to hear national rhetoric about illegal immigrants taking jobs and committing crime, even though, the data shows that that's not true. But that continuing narrative leads to a rise in immigrant victimization. And part of this issue also comes down to the fact that if an immigrant is not here legally, they're going to be less likely to report any kind of crime because they don't want police involved. They don't want to be deported back to their country. So it leads to this weird compounding issue that gets worse and worse. And so victimization of individuals that are centered around immigration are both part of this larger conversation, but are also a separate data piece that we need to understand, especially when we look at the data of victimization for Latinx as well as Asian American. When we look at those data rates, if you think about it, they're lower percentages than the other ones. That might be partially due to immigrant victimization. It may as well also be just less crime committed. It's a complex and complicated system, but it's important to mention that this is something we need to understand is a component of this. And right towards the end of this chapter in our text, it breaks down something that is important, and I wanted to give it a little bit of a special treatment here. Um, so what it does is it's under the big section starting on page 86, why racial differences in criminal victimization are significant. And obviously the first thing is that what we've been talking about the whole time, people of color are at greater risk of being victimized. So we get that. That's pretty straightforward. That's what we've talked about this whole time. But the second consequence, really, the second concern of victimization based off of the data we've seen is that there's psychological, medical, economic, and behavioral consequences of being victimized, and that's the whole thing. There's a lot of research by criminologists, psychologists, etc. And this is originally just a bulleted list, but I put it in a numbered list to make it easier for you. There are 6 consequences of victimization that this vast collection of data shows us that our authors have put forward in a short list. And we're just going to talk about those 6 briefly, and that's going to be the end of this lecture for this week. And that is that criminal victimization costs victims nearly $20 billion annually in direct costs, and realistically, and probably hundreds of billions in indirect costs. And if you're like, what the heck is a direct cost and indirect cost? The text does break that down. Direct costs are things like loss of money or property, immediate medical costs and charges, lost wages from not being able to work, while indirect costs are lost productivity, medical care for enduring mental and physical health problems, victim services, child care. You pick this result that came from being victimized that was not because you victimized them, but because they've been dealing with long term issues, that's an indirect cost. Our second consequence is that some crime victims suffer from anxiety, depression, loss of self esteem, substance abuse problems, sleeplessness, suicidal tendencies, which is a decent band, social relationship problems, and other such issues. A consequence of victimization is that it's not just that you committed a crime against them, it's that so many other long term kind of problems pop up because of victimization. So it's not just a simple, oh, you did this, you stole someone's family heirloom. Okay, that's your only crime. Well, no. By stealing their family heirloom, you may have also made them anxious, depressed. They might have sleep problems now. They might turn to using medication to numb that pain, and then they now have a substance abuse problem. Like, victimizing an individual is not just victimizing for that one crime, it's other things. Um, the third piece is that there's indirect victimization, and it's felt by relatives and friends of victims. What we mean here is that just because a crime was committed against one person doesn't mean they're the only victim. People that are close to the target victim, if we had to put a term on it, these are people that also can be victimized. They might not feel safe. They might suffer from some of these additional problems that come from being victimized. They might also be part of what costs come for victims. When we look at the fourth point is perhaps one of the ones that I think most people are going to have issue with in general, and that is that children are indirectly victimized when they hear gunshots or see violence actually occurring, as this secondary exposure to violence may impair their mental health and school performance. So, what we're talking about here is that you don't have to choose a child as a victim to make them a victim. They tend to be an unintended victim, an indirect victim, when they are in the presence of violence occurring. Really, if a child is witness to an assault on their parent, they're an indirect victim. Even though the offender never physically touched the child, they were still victimized by watching their parent get violently assaulted. So there is a lot of data that shows that children are victimized by being in the presence of violence and gunshots. Um, it does play an impact in their development. And because of that exposure to violence, it could negatively impact their mental health and it can affect their school performance, which then could lead to a myriad of other issues like children dropping out, turning to a life of crime, turning to substances. Like, there are potential further issues from just one part. And so it's important to understand that these are complicated. Our fifth consequence is that some victims become more likely to commit crime themselves because of their victimization, especially if it occurs during childhood or adolescence. So I kind of mentioned that one earlier, and I said we'd talk about it in a little bit. This is something that we've seen, and they even give us a citation for all of these points, by the way, to the particular studies with data that shows this. But individuals who are victims of crime, how do I want to say this? Victims of any crime in general, everyone is unique. Not everyone responds to the same thing in the same way. Um, because it's not my story to tell and it's extremely personal, I'm just going to say that I have had multiple close friends and close relationships who were victims of violence, victims of assault, and I had more than one victim of this friends that were victims of the same crime. that responded in very different ways. So sometimes victims may feel powerless and they might feel power by committing crime themselves. And so that does play a part in all this. And so it's important to note that not everyone is going to respond to being victimized the same way. There is no right way to there's no right way to experience trauma or to experience victimization and reply to it. There are wrong ways to reply to victimization. One of them would be to commit crime yourself, but in general, there's not a right way to handle these situations. So it's just important to understand. Excuse me. And then the last kind of point, this last unintended consequence of victimization. Victimization can generate fear in a whole community, a whole neighborhood. It can keep people inside their residencies or prompt them to move away. If a community is really shaken up about a particular crime and victimization, it can have wide reaching and long lasting effects. And you can see whole communities change based off of one crime. Um, in part, something I would like to put forward as food for thought for several of you. Victimization can generate fear in whole communities. We're going to just take off neighborhoods and say communities. We're going to take the last part off. Victimization can generate fear in whole communities. I urge you to think about a lot of the cases of police brutality on African American individuals. The victimization of Black Americans by white police officers, typically, has generated a generalized fear and hate towards all officers within the criminal justice system. The police have created a aura of fear around them when that's not what they should be doing. So, just a thought to kind of put this in perspective, victimization doesn't have to be for just one individual. Sometimes it can affect a lot of people, not just a neighborhood. It can affect an entire generation. It can affect an entire country. If you're old enough, I urge you to think back to September 11th, 2001. Victimized, the American people felt victimized by a few terroristic hijacking of planes and crashes that led to destruction and death, led to entire country of people afraid about their safety. Victimization does not just hit the person who is the direct target. It can hit a lot further. So that's hopefully that explanation, that extra piece helps you understand this a little bit better. And then the last piece of this text talks about, and I didn't make a slide on it because we've talked it a little bit to death, but remember back in week 2, our coverage of crime, the way the public generally sees crime data and things of that nature. We see an increased number of black victims, or rather black offenders, to white victims. We see the data shows that that's a small percentage. Leads to the way we feel about these individuals and how they become victimized and targeted, and oh my gosh, this is a super complex issue that is not straightforward, almost like exactly what Mr. Wheaton said. Yeah, this is complicated, it's messy, and I did warn you at the beginning of this lecture this was not going to be an easy class conversation day. So thank you for sticking it out with me. That is the end of the lecture. Um, Again, I know this was not an easy lesson. This was not an easy conversation to have. Um, if you were confused at any point and you need some kind of clarification, please reach out to me. Email me and let me know what you're confused on, and I'd be glad to work with you one on one to kind of work through it. If something that we discussed here in this lecture um, triggered you or brought up some uh, undealt with or previously dealt with emotions or things that are problematic and are causing something with you to happen, um, please, you can feel free to reach out to me and talk to me about it. I'm not a professional in that field, but I'd be glad to at least offer an ear. Um, Remember that, you know, we are working with the Crime Victim Center, so if that is something that you need to go to, it is a free service. It does not cost you anything, and they are there to help you no matter when a crime may have happened. Um, if you've not been a victim of crime, but something like this has really affected you, we can put you in touch with people who are professionals. So just feel free to reach out to me or reach out to our student success coach in this class is Clarissa Stewart Baker, or our other academic counselor. You can reach out to Andrea Obert, or our dean of students, Dr. Kareth Bowman. Any of those individuals or myself, if you need additional services because this content is not easy to process and is difficult, I'm trying to do it in the best way possible that does not traumatize or re-victimize anyone. If something is going on, please let one of us know, and so we can at least get you the help that you may need. Um, but that's it. Um, Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you all soon.